Introducing an all-new channel, JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL that don't get talked about on this channel in a completely relaxed, unscripted format. Newest video is up, where I talk about the Week 18 television schedule and what markets don't make any sense in terms of what games they're getting, and I talk about the feud between Aaron Rodgers and Jimmy Kimmel and what potential litigation could come out of it. So go check that out and subscribe. And now, on with our feature presentation. December 25th, 1971. One of the most infamous days in NFL history. I've talked about it before in depth on this channel, so if you do want to learn more about what happened on that day, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, to make a long story short, the NFL decided to have two of its playoff games, a battle between the Cowboys and the Vikings, and a battle between the Chiefs and the Dolphins, take place on Christmas Day. Instead of avoiding the holiday, they decided to play on the holiday for the first time ever. Now today, you might think that this isn't a big deal. The NFL plays on Christmas every year they possibly can. We've grown accustomed to it, and the ratings are through the roof. But back in 1971, when Christmas was way more of a religious holiday to the average American than it is today, and when they tried it for the first time, and in a big stakes game, disaster. Absolute disaster. The results were so bad that politicians protested the league and demanded that the league never play on Christmas again. The league was blamed for ruining Christmas dinners all across the country, especially since Dolphins Chiefs happened to go into double overtime, and the league, despite having many opportunities to play on the holiday in the years since, avoided playing on Christmas again until 1989, 2 decades later. You can learn more about why they reversed course after 2 decades by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Bottom line, playing on Christmas in 1971 was a complete and utter disaster. But what you might not know is that this was not the first time that the NFL was planning on playing games on Christmas. Not at all. Because maybe the whole disaster that happened in 1971 would have been avoided if there was a similar disaster that took place in 1966, 5 years earlier. Because in 1966, the NFL, if it came down to it, was planning on having playoff games on Christmas Day. And if 1971 was anything to go off of, let's just say that the NFL probably dodged a bullet in 1966 by having the scenario narrowly avoided by the skin of their teeth. Because this is the story behind one of the strangest playoff scenarios in NFL history, otherwise known as the Christmas Day debacle. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and what the NFL was planning on doing, we need some context to understand what the playoff picture was looking like, and more importantly, how the playoffs were structured back then. The year is 1966, and this is, by far, the hardest year to get into the playoffs. The rules are the same as always. You need to win your conference in order to get into the postseason, so it's first place or nothing. However, adding an extra wrinkle into the mix this year is the addition of the Atlanta Falcons, meaning that there are 15 teams fighting for 2 spots. So if everyone's got even odds, your chances of making the playoffs this year are somewhere around 13%. For some perspective, in 2023, the odds of a team making the playoffs are 43%. This year more than ever, a few losses derail your season completely, and leave you with nothing to play for by the second half of the season but pride. Having said that, even though this was as tough of a year to make the playoffs as ever, the races were nothing short of riveting. We're going to start in the Western Conference, as in the conference you've been watching for the past minute, where by this point in the season, you had 2 teams fighting for that spot. In one corner, you had the Green Bay Packers, who were sitting atop with a 10-2 record, and were showing no signs of slowing down following their championship-winning season the year before in 1965. Through their first 12 games, they were atop the Western Conference thanks to a suffocating defense that had allowed just 130 points, or 10.8 points per game, and an offense that was the best in the conference, having scored 294 points, or over 24.5 points per game. They had the top point differential in the conference, and it wasn't even close. Their point differential was plus 164, which was more than double what the next best team in the conference was, with the Rams at plus 81. And now, with 2 games to go, the Packers were one win away from making it back into the NFL Championship for the second straight year, and for the fifth time in the last 7 years under head coach Vince Lombardi. However, even though you wouldn't expect the Packers to collapse down the stretch, there was one team right on their tail with 2 games to go, and that was this team right here, the Baltimore Colts. They were right behind the Packers with an 8-4 record, thanks to the second-best offense in the conference, and a defense that was one of just 4 teams in the 15-team league at this point to allow under 200 total points. Yes, it would take a lot on paper for this team right here, the Colts, to catch the Packers for a share of the Western Conference. But it honestly wasn't crazy. For one, the Packers had 2 games left, and one of them was on the road against the Los Angeles Rams, who were 8-5, and who had lost just 1 game at home all season. The other one, on the road against none other than the Baltimore Colts. The Colts needed 3 things to happen for them to have a share of the Western Conference title. All of them were pretty realistic. Beat the Packers, beat the 49ers, who were hovering around 500, and who lost to the Colts 36-14 earlier in the season, in a game that wasn't even remotely close, and have the Packers lose to one of the best teams in the NFL on the road in the Rams. What happens if the Packers and Colts tie for the conference title? Well, we'll get to that in just a bit, because this wasn't the only conference that this was an issue in. Because now, we're going to focus on the Eastern Conference, starting with this team right here, the Dallas Cowboys. Yes, the Baltimore Colts were in the West, and the Dallas Cowboys were in the East, because that makes perfect sense. Through their first 12 games, the Cowboys were quite possibly looking like the best team in all of football. They were atop the East with a 9-2-1 record, having the best offense in football by a fairly comfortable margin. They had scored 397 points by this point, or well over 33 points per game, which was nearly a full touchdown per game ahead of the next best total in the league. And they had a great defense that was number 1 in the Eastern Conference in points allowed. Led by a slew of Pro Bowlers, with 9 of the 22 starters making the Pro Bowl that season, including guys like wide receiver Bob Hayes, defensive tackle Bob Lilly, linebacker Chuck Howley, and safety Mel Renfro, all of whom would eventually wind up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. They seemed like they were in a very good spot, thanks to their plus 199 point differential, which was the best total in football, to make it to the NFL Championship and have a winning record for the first time ever. However, that was not even close to a done deal, because for the Cowboys, there were 2 teams right on their tail for first place in the Eastern Conference. One of them was this team right here, the St. Louis Cardinals. Notice the tie on the Cowboys' record and how they're 9-2-1? Well, entering their game against the Cardinals, the Cowboys were a perfect 4-0. It was the Cardinals that gave them their first blemish, and vice versa, the Cowboys gave the Cardinals their first blemish, as the Cardinals entered that game with a 5-0 record. Through their first 12 games, St. Louis was a game behind Dallas with an 8-3-1 record, and even though their offense had faltered a bit as of late, thanks to some inconsistent play at quarterback, and a bad stretch where they only crossed the 20-point mark once in their last 6 games, their defense was still a great unit that ended up finishing the year with the fewest yards allowed in the league, thanks in part to eventual Hall of Fame safety Larry Wilson, who led the league with 10 interceptions that year and was very nearly named the MVP of the league. Oh, and to make this so more interesting, with 2 games to go, the Cardinals weren't the only team that had a shot at getting a share of the Eastern Conference. Because you also had this team right here, the Cleveland Browns, who were fighting for a share of the crown. Remember how I said earlier that the Cowboys were a full touchdown per game ahead of the second best offense in football at the time? This was that team. The Cleveland Browns had scored 344 points by this point, and under the guidance of head coach Wayne Collier, 2 years removed from winning their final NFL championship to date, they were sitting at 8-4, and were one of the hottest teams in football. After losing 2 of their first 3 games, the Browns had rebounded nicely, and had won 7 of their last 9 games to find themselves in this spot. And to make matters all the more interesting, guess who the Browns were playing to close out the season? That's right, the St. Louis Cardinals. It's as though the schedule makers had designed this thing perfectly. So that raises the question, what happens if the conferences are tied? If you've got 2 teams atop the conference, like the teams you're watching right now in the Cardinals and Cowboys, and the Packers and Colts, or heck, 3 teams atop, as could have been the case in the Eastern Conference, how are you deciding this bad boy? Well, there were no tiebreakers. Tiebreakers were a fairly foreign concept back then. We saw that in 1970, when the NFL was so unprepared when it came to a tiebreaker system that they almost had to resort to a coin flip to determine who would be the final playoff team in the NFC. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. If teams were tied for first place, simply put, they would play a playoff game against each other. You would add another game to the schedule, and you would push everything back a week. If the NFL Championship was supposed to be on December 27th, but there was a tie in one of the conferences, you would just move it back to January 4th and play the tiebreaker game on December 27th instead. Not really a big deal considering the way the game worked back then, and because the NFL Championship was taking place at a non-neutral site. So it's like baseball or basketball or any other sport where it's extremely easy to make arrangements and for the local fans to show up. But in 1966, you had this massive dilemma, because there would be a 3-way tie atop the Eastern Conference potentially, especially since ties were not a super rare occurrence, so it could happen. Heck, the previous year in 1965, all that had to happen to avoid a tie atop the Western Conference entering the final week of the season was that the Green Bay Packers could not tie their game against the San Francisco 49ers. And sure enough, they tied. And that dilemma was because when you throw the Super Bowl into the mix, as in the first ever championship between the NFL and the rival AFL, and that was guaranteed to be played at a neutral site in Los Angeles on January 15th, you didn't have a ton of wiggle room. You didn't have weeks to play with. The regular season ends on December 18th, so you've got 3 weeks in between the end of the regular season and the Super Bowl. And you might need all 3 of those weeks if there's a 3-way tie. The first Eastern Conference tiebreaker game has to be on Christmas week. The Western Conference playoff and the Eastern Conference playoff have to be on the week of New Year's, and the NFL Championship has to be the week after that. You have to squeeze it in, no questions asked. The schedule is nowhere near as flexible as it could have been in previous years. And this meant that, with the possibility of a tiebreaker between all these teams that you're watching being an extremely real possibility, Commissioner Pete Rozelle did the unthinkable. He said that if there was a tie, seeing as Christmas Day fell on a Sunday, that the playoff tiebreakers before the NFL Championship would be held on Christmas. If there was a tie in the Western Conference between Green Bay and Baltimore at 10-4, if there was a tie in the Eastern Conference between Dallas, St. Louis, and Cleveland at 9-4-1, or if there was a tie in the Eastern Conference between Dallas and St. Louis at 10-3-1, or 9-4-1, or 9-3-2, then that game would be held on December 25th, making it the first time ever that the league would play on Christmas. They usually avoided the holiday because playing professional football on Christmas, especially back in the 1960s, when the holiday was way more religious for the average American, was sacrilegious, and they knew the uproar that it would cause. They played the NFL Championship before on December 26th, even when that was a Monday, specifically to avoid playing on Christmas. But not this time. Under this bizarre scenario, the NFL said that Christmas Day would be the date for these playoff games. But here's what makes no sense to me in my mind. This was not an unavoidable scenario. In 1971, during this playoff debacle right here, okay, I got it. I got why the NFL wanted to have playoff games on Christmas. In many ways, it felt like a necessity. You had 4 playoff games taking place that weekend, so you had to do 2 of them on Saturday and 2 of them on Sunday. Because December 25th was a Saturday that year, it meant that Monday, December 27th, would not be treated as a national holiday. So if you played the 2 playoff games on that Monday, a lot of people would be forced to miss the games due to those games taking place during the workday, especially because primetime playoff games were not even close to a thing yet. And you couldn't play those 2 Saturday games on Friday, since that would be a short week for everyone involved, not just from a player recovery standpoint, but from a selling tickets standpoint. And it could be unfair for the winning team to have a 2-day advantage over the winning team on Sunday from a rest standpoint. So once again, you're stuck. I get why the NFL did it. The only way to avoid a situation like this was to move the games back a week and take a bye week in between the regular season and the playoffs. But that was never going to happen, and that would be chaos on the networks since they've got bowl games to air as well during the weekend that you'd be doing that. So there's not enough room in the TV calendar. Or you could have all 4 playoff games take place on the same day, that Sunday, and give each network a doubleheader. But obviously, that would never be agreed to by the networks because they would lose a ton of revenue. You couldn't do the bye week solution. Again, the networks had to air bowl games the weekend of January 1st and January 2nd, so you're completely screwed. The situation in 1971 stunk, but it might not have been avoidable. It was a situation where there was nothing the league could have really done about it. The calendar was just awful. In 1966, though, this season right here, why was this even a consideration? Seriously, why was this considered an option? Christmas Day fell on a Sunday, so couldn't you just have played the playoff games on Saturday? Couldn't you just have done a Saturday doubleheader on Christmas Eve, played on that day like you've done in the past with no issue, and gotten it over with pain-free? Play the Eastern Conference playoff at 1 o'clock, play the Western Conference playoff at 4 o'clock, or do it at 12 o'clock and 3:30, whatever floats your boat, and you're good. I know CBS had a contractual obligation to air the Blue-Gray Football Classic, which was an all-star bowl game. But couldn't you play one of the playoff games right after that? Or before that? Or put a game on December 26th? Since that would be a holiday due to the fact that Christmas fell on a Sunday? You played on December 26th before, specifically to avoid playing on Christmas, specifically to avoid this nightmare. Heck, in 1960, you played the title game on that Monday afternoon, and attendance wasn't an issue, with over 67,000 people packing into the stadium. Why couldn't you just do that again? If there's only one playoff game, play it on Christmas Eve after the Blue-Gray Football Classic. Or you pay CBS and the Bowl a boatload of money to move their game to a different day. Or if there are 2 games, you play one on Christmas Eve and one on that Monday since that's a holiday. It's not that hard. It's not that freaking hard. You had no excuse for this one. You can't talk about how you want to avoid playing on Christmas and how your mantra has always been to avoid playing on that holiday, and then go ahead and do this. It makes no sense to me. Remember, teams did not like playing on holidays back then. Until the Cowboys volunteered in 1966, the NFL was begging for a second team to play on Thanksgiving alongside the Lions. You're going to come for and disrupt 2 holidays, and 2 of the biggest holidays in America, in the same year? You're going to add a second game on Thanksgiving, and possibly play 2 games on Christmas when that's never been done before, all because of your poor planning and greed? Come on. Having said that, there's a reason that you probably have not heard about this scheduling crisis before, and that is because, well, this never actually happened. To say that the NFL dodged a bullet here would be putting it lightly, and fortunately for them, not a single one of their conference races had to be decided by a playoff tiebreaker. Because as you could tell from watching these highlights, the Packers took care of business, and the Cowboys took care of business. The Packers ended up defeating the Colts in Baltimore by a final score of 14-10, so the Western Conference was wrapped up with a game to go, as the Packers had a 3-game lead with 1 to play. As for the Eastern Conference, the Cardinals slumped hard, losing their final 3 games of the season, including 1 to the expansion Atlanta Falcons of all teams, and the Cowboys took care of their business, finishing the season at 10-3-1, knowing their fate going into the final Sunday of the season, seeing as the Cardinals-Browns game took place on Saturday. Crisis averted. We got our Packers-Cowboys NFL Championship on New Year's Day down in Dallas, with no controversy or conflict whatsoever. And yes, the Cowboys-Packers NFL Championship took place in Dallas, even though the Packers had a better record than the Cowboys. To learn more about why that was the case, click the card in the upper right corner. But the Christmas crisis was averted, to say the least. It's very interesting to see what would have happened in 1971 if it wasn't for what happened in 1966, and if those games ended up getting played on Christmas Day. History changes completely, especially with how we remember games like the Chiefs-Dolphins Double Overtime Classic, because a big reason people remember that game is because of the fact that it was on Christmas. But what does the league do in 1971 if this happens? Because in 1971, they just delayed the inevitable by 5 years because the games weren't taking place in 1966. It was still a very religious holiday in 1971, just like it was in 1966. So you had to figure that the backlash in 1966, if they played playoff games on Christmas Day, would be really, really bad. There would be a ton of backlash, a ton of pushback, and I don't think the NFL would make the same mistake again in 1971 because they would probably get a ton of criticism in 1966. So how does history change? Who knows? Maybe the 1971 season starts a week later than it would have started either way. Maybe the Super Bowl gets pushed back a week. Who knows? It's a fun hypothetical and a fun scenario to think about because of the fact that there were no games that took place on Christmas in 1966. Well, they were not so lucky in 1971. As a side note, the case behind me right here, the helmets are arranged in a very particular way. If you think you know why that is the case, the order of the helmets, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. There have been a lot of bizarre playoff scenarios heading into the final week of the season, or the final few weeks of the season. But good luck finding another one that's weirder than this. You've got the possibility of both conferences ending with ties, a three-way tiebreaker in one of the conferences where 2 playoff games would be played, with one team getting a random bye week via a coin flip, and the biggest one of them all for the purposes of our story, playoff games on Christmas for the first time ever, at a time when the NFL always seemed to avoid the holiday, and at a time when the NFL, simply put, did not need to do this. Because in 1966, we were just a few results away from that year being known as the year that the NFL was the Grinch that stole Christmas. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.